From the very beginning, the Spirit of God has breathed over the whole of creation. God's Spirit breathing throughout the whole of the universe. We know that in Genesis, when we hear the word Spirit, that this is the breath of God. We know from our reading of the Old Testament that Spirit is breath, the breath that God breathes into the world at all times. And we know from the New Testament that God's Spirit, God's breath, is the fullness of God's very self. God is in the world, moving through the whole of the universe. God breathing God's self into everything that is. And every place and every time where we are, there is the breath of God breathing through. And sometimes we may be aware of God's presence. We may feel that breeze come across us the way on a hot summer day, a breeze will suddenly come up and we'll suddenly be aware of this cool, refreshing breeze that blows across us. And for a moment we pause and appreciate the moment, the cool breeze that cools and refreshes us. And we pause to soak it in, so to speak, to draw in that beautiful moment. God's breathing into the whole of the universe. And we know that this breath is life. We hear it in the second chapter of Genesis, when God creates the first human out of the earth and breathes into that human, Adam, and he comes and is filled with life, divine life. We hear it in the prophet Ezekiel this morning. The dry bones, that wonderful vivid imagery of God's breath bringing life to inanimate, inert matter, changing from that which is without life to that which is filled with life. And for how many of us would love to feel that breath of God fill us, to literally inspire us. What does inspire mean but to breathe into, to fill with the Spirit, to fill with one's breath, to be inspired. And sometimes in our life we may have that deep longing for life. We may be aware that we are physically alive, but the fullness of what it means and what it feels like, the experience of being fully alive. And God comes breathing. God knows this desire. If we have this desire in our heart, God knows this desire. And God breathes. God breathes. God's Spirit, the fullness of God's self, breathes towards us. But yet, how many, perhaps even with that deep desire for life, imagine, if you will, that you, for whatever reason, are suffocating. I know it's not a pleasant image, but bear with me. There's no breath, there's no air, there's nothing. And that gasp, the panic that comes with not being able to catch our breath, And here comes God, in God's Holy Spirit. God hears our cry, sees our distress, God comes in God's self. God comes as the Holy Spirit, but we don't need help. We don't need help. I don't need somebody to help me breathe. Yeah, true, I'm suffocating right now and I can't catch my breath and I'm in full bodily panic, but I don't want you to know that, right? How? Because we all know, we talk about this here many times. Right? What did we say to the suffocating person? Are you okay? Are you okay? Do you need God's breath? Do you need God's life? I'm fine. I'm totally fine. I don't need anything. I'm fine. Right? We're all fine. publicly. We're fine. Despite that deep desire, despite the fact that we may not be able to catch our breath, God is right there to breathe this life into us. The kiss of life, right? If you've ever studied, right, how to resuscitate someone, we call it the kiss of life. God right there in the fullness of God's self and God's Spirit to give us the kiss of life. No. Because we don't need God. We don't need God. I mean, the people, like, let's talk about the characteristics of people who really need God. They're weak. They're weak. They're dependent. They just can't do it themselves. They just don't have what it takes to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and take care of it with their own rugged, individualistic self. Because we don't need help. Oh, well, maybe I'm suffocating. That's all right. That's all right. How many of us, don't raise your hands, right? We would rather die than ask for help. It's not a good thing, okay? This aversion, these walls that we put up that cause ourselves harm. We block out the gift of God's Holy Spirit. It's here. It's blowing right by. God, in God's wisdom, knows what we need and is right there to help us with everything that God is. But no. We'll take care of that ourselves. And it's not just breath as life. We know that God's breath is God's Spirit, and God's Spirit is God's self, and the exhalation of God into the universe breathes life into the universe, breathes life into all who will breathe in the Spirit, who will breathe it in and allow God's life to infuse and inform and indeed literally inspire our lives. The refreshment of the cool breeze on the hot summer day that brings relief and joy, peace in a moment, can refresh us, can turn our whole day around if we can breathe in God's Spirit, if we can breathe in God's Spirit. But that's not the fullness of it even. God's breath, God's Spirit, the fullness of God's self breathed into the world, the power that the Creator has over the creature. And I think this is how we as human beings sometimes can get away with, over and over again. We can get away with, I'm fine, everything's fine, I'm great, I'm really great. How are you? Things couldn't be better, right? But how is it that we can get away with I'm fine? How much of the hurt, the toxicity of life do we carry on the inside? We can get up on a Sunday morning, bathe, and put on nice clothes, and do our hair, and come, and for all outward appearances. What a beautiful community we are. What a beautiful community we are. Jonathan, yes, get a shot of this beautiful community here. Because you're all dressed up. You're all dressed up. You all look great. So let's let the world see. Let's let the world see. And I'm not being facetious, by the way. You really do look great. You look beautiful. I mean that. I mean that. And sometimes that's how we feel. Some days are like that. Some days we feel beautiful. Some days we feel whole we feel healed. We don't feel in our bodies, in ourselves, in our souls, in our psyches, some of the woundedness and the hurt that we have experienced in our lives and still carry those interior wounds that no medicine will reach. Those wounds that we carry that are so deep that it seems that maybe perhaps only air can get there. Only God's healing breath. The life that God breathes into the universe, the life that God desires to breathe into you and me, is more than just life. It's the healing power of the Creator over the creature. Again, just as God knows the desires of our hearts, God knows. God knows our pain. God knows our suffering. God knows the wounds that we carry, the hurts that we carry, in all their forms, all the various forms, all the various kinds of brokenness and woundedness that human beings experience just by being alive, just by being in the world and interacting in the world. God can heal it. God can heal the broken heart. God can heal the wounded soul. God can, and God will, and we know that God does desire to heal us from the inside out, to make us whole from the inside out, to heal a broken heart, to heal a wounded soul. But if we bury those wounds too deeply, if we have learned to ignore them, to deny them, I'm thinking about someone, and by the way, this could actually apply to a number of people, but it's not you. Right, the person walking like this. And you're like, is your hip okay? Well, it's just bone on bone, and it's just been bone on bone like this now for 10 or 15 years. Well, you know they can heal that. I know, but I've been watching YouTube videos about how to give myself a hip replacement. So I think at the end of the day, it'll probably be fine. I can do it myself. I'll do it myself. Are you sure? Yeah, because I'm fine. Right? Exactly. Right? Again, it's comical at one level, right? From one perspective, it is comical. On the other hand, it's pretty tragic. This human, right, we don't have to admit to one another. We don't have to, but sometimes talking with a trusted friend, a trusted family member, sharing our grief, sharing our experience, having those people that we can talk to is deeply healing, but we don't have to. We can just tell God. We can just tell God what we need. Remember that Jesus says, when you pray, go into your room by yourself. And pray to your Father in secret, and your Father who sees and hears in secret will bless you. It doesn't have to be public. What God is doing for us right now, what God is offering us right now, God powerfully present in this place, as close to each of us as the air we breathe. I'm going to say that again. It's really important. God is close to each one of us, always as close to each one of us as the air we breathe. And just as we can sometimes pause to catch our breath, and I find the older I get, the more often I pause to catch my breath. And like half a dozen of you just yawned. That was awesome. But that's good. A yawn is good, right? If you now it's become infectious. All right. I'm not going to point out who was doing it, but you know. But that, right? That, I'm not saying do this right now. But if you want to, feel free to. But right, that big gulp of air is like that big gulp of God. A big, deep breath of oxygen is a big, deep breath of God. Pentecost, the moment we pause to remember the gift of God's self as God's Holy Spirit, continuously, always, everywhere, breathing and moving, breathing and moving. And it's a gift, God's gift to you, to me, to the whole universe. God present always and everywhere. And the fullness of God, and the fullness of God's grace, and the fullness of God's love, and the fullness of God's blessing, everything that God desires to communicate to us is right here as the very air we breathe. But once again, I can only name the gift to you. I can only remind all of us here of who God is and how God is present with us. I can say again what it is that God desires to give to each of us. But I can't make you breathe. I can't make you pray. I can't make you pause in your day to be present to God who is present with you powerfully and fully as God's breath, God's spirit, God's self. Whether or not we all here choose to breathe God is up to each of us. God will let us hold our breath for as long as we want to. Have you ever been a parent? That's like 15 seconds past the last time you did it, kid. Good job. Good job. We are all God's children. We are all, without exception, God's children. So on this Pentecost, I leave you with this. Remember to breathe. Remember to breathe. Remember to breathe deeply. To breathe deeply. To breathe deeply, not only of the air and the oxygen that we need to live, but to know that in the air, in the oxygen, is the fullness of God. I'll say it again. God is as close to each one of us as our own breathing, is as close to each of us as the air we breathe, and is always there for us. Should we decide we want to be filled with God's life? Should we decide that we want to be filled with God's love? Should we decide that we want to be filled with God's healing? Should we decide that we want to be filled with the fullness of God, open to receiving whatever blessing, grace God chooses to give us in that moment? No one will make us take that deep breath. But know this. Whenever we're ready to take that deep breath, God will be as God's breath, God's spirit, God's self. God will be right there and will be powerfully and personally in that deep gulp of air that we take, opening ourselves to be filled with God's Spirit.